I've shared this story a few times on video, but there was a time when I was working in New York City and I went out to lunch with a bunch of my friends, and for some reason the conversation came about God, and they knew I believed in God. They knew I was a Christian, and they turned to me and asked, "Why do you believe in God?" And my response was that, how can you deny a God who time and time has predicted the rise and falls of kingdoms, the rise and falls of kings, sometimes named kings specifically before, hundreds of years before they were born, and somehow it always happens, it always plays out exactly how God said it would play out. And as I left that conversation, I was always a little troubled. I wanted to give more examples, and kind of what came to mind was the warrings of the kings of the north and the south in the book of Daniel, because I've never really read so much descriptions of rise and falls of empires before. Now, what we see in Daniel 11 is, a couple things. Either this was written by God, or it's all a lie. There's no way that anybody could have seen the things that are going to take place. And now we know that Daniel wrote this first and foremost because Daniel was a very successful man in Babylon. And then after the Persians conquered Babylon, he was a very successful man for the Persians as well. And a lot of his writings were saved and stored in Babylonian libraries and Persian libraries, so much so that the wise men who then came and found Jesus following the star read Daniel's prophecies to realize, hey, that's happening, that thing that Daniel wrote about. But what Daniel's writing about here is he's given a vision. He receives a vision, and what he sees is these warrings between the kings of the north and the south. And what these are, let's start with, is we're talking about Israel and the kingdom north of Israel and the kingdom south of Israel. So if we look at chapter 11, it just is incredible. What it starts with in 3 is it says, "Then a mighty king shall arise who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." Now that was Alexander the Great, and he came 380 years after Daniel died. "And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided towards the four winds of heaven." It was split up between 4 generals. "But not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted even for others besides these." So there was no heritage with his kingdom. It just was straight up split between 4 generals. And then we get into the 2 that are the north and the south. So we have the Seleucus who took over the northern region above Israel, and then we have Ptolemy who took over the southern region of Egypt and northern Africa, Ethiopia, that area. And what we see is throughout all of chapter 11 is this warring between the 2, but it's not just between those 2 kings, because several times the kingdom changed hands, but it was always the Ptolemaic and the Seleucus empires. It stayed that way for hundreds and hundreds of years until finally the Romans took over, and we can see this exchange back and forth. And if you read the pages of Daniel chapter 11, you'll see and you follow it with the Greek history into the Roman history, it literally is word for word exactly how it played out. There's no errors or mistakes. If you take the time to study out, how it went from Alexander the Great to Ptolemy and Seleucus, and then how those powers heads changed each time, all the way to the Roman Empire, which picks up in verse 19, and it goes all the way through the destruction of the Maccabees, who were 485 years, I believe, to 500 years after Daniel's death. All of it just clearly written out, somewhere between a half a century before any of these people involved in these things were even born. So what we see with the warnings of the north and the south, most people read this and they just blast through it. But if you take a little bit of time and you line it up with history, which we will, by the way, because once we're done with Malachi on Sunday mornings, we're going to go through Daniel. When we get to chapter 11, we'll match every verse up with history, how it played out. But you can obviously do that yourself. all the way through the rise of, then we kind of get into the rise of the Antichrist around verse 39. It's fascinating. And then so far what we see in our modern history is things are playing out just like it said in the rest of chapter 11. You can't read that and deny that to be God. I mean, clearly it was predicted. I mean, there is so much detail in these verses that it's impossible to deny God. And we know that Daniel wrote it because his writings are very famous in Persian and Babylonian history. Again, the wise men followed Daniel's writing to find Jesus Christ. It's fascinating, fascinating stuff. Everything throughout chapter 11 played out through Greek history, into the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid empires, into the Roman empires, exactly how it says. Every battle, every exchange of kingdoms, everything played out. Even taxations are spelled out clearly in the pages of Daniel. So, there's just one example of how history plays out. But even, you can go all the way back to Ezekiel, who then, or Isaiah, who then predicted King Cyrus, named King Cyrus, not only predicted the capture of the Jews and led off to Babylon, but it said that King Cyrus will release them. And then 600 years later, there's a guy named King Cyrus who releases them. I mean, you can't deny a God like that. He gets it right every single time. So there you go. Love to hear your thoughts on all that. Put it in the comments below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. If you feel called to support this channel with Patreon, that link is below. But the most important part of this channel, we take prayer requests. Never hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.